On, my friends. But I'm Roger Patterson, and I'm joined today by Dr. Jennifer Hall-Rivera and Tim Chafee. So we are the giant lineup. I'm 5'18", and Tim's 5'21", so we're a little taller than most folks. But great to have a live audience here today. You guys can clap and let everybody hear you're here. We did this for several months with no audience, and it was a little awkward. So we love having you guys here at the museum, Creation Museum, enjoying things. We do a lot of different things here. This is one of the programs we offer on Mondays and Wednesdays. Another thing we're doing, beginning again this fall, are our high school biology labs. You want to mention a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we have our high school labs. Registration is open for those, and we're having biology, which is full, right, which is great news. We also have chemistry, which is taught by Mr. Patterson himself, and we also are offering forensic science. And so we do still have spots available for those high schoolers who are homeschooled and looking for that lab practicum right here at the Creation Museum in our science lab. Exciting opportunity.
And I get paid to blow stuff up, so
yeah.
It's great. I love it. So, all right, our little fluff article we've got today as people are getting online and joining us on the different feeds. If you want to be following along on Ken Ham's Facebook page or the AIG Facebook page, YouTube comments, we'll be monitoring those and watching those as we go through. All right, this first article is titled, Insects Showcase Unexpected Ways to Make Water Repellent Surfaces. All right, so if we think about God's amazing design of insects, how many insects are there in the world? If you've been to the insectorium down around in Palm Plaza, you've seen a lot of those amazing designs. And here we see God's design for these insects. Now imagine if you were, let's say, 200 pounds and you're walking along and something that was 20% of your body weight slammed into you falling out of the sky. Okay? That's what a mosquito would feel like if it got hit by a small drop of rain flying through the air. So God's made these insects in an amazing way. And these little microstructures that are all over them, these little bumps, you can see a piece of that there in that inset down at the bottom, is what the surface of their scales and other parts of their body look like. That one specifically is from the mosquito's eye, and that helps them to shed that water. So if you think about these types of things, have you ever used any products on your car, like the Rain-X or different polishes and things that do that?
Oh, yes, and it helps the water bubble up and kind of repel its surface. And they study insects so they can actually develop new repellent surfaces and technology for us. To help repel water. So it's kind of fascinating what we can learn. And it's not surprising they would find that a tightly packed structure was more repellent than something that was more sparse, right? That makes a lot of sense that the more tightly packed these spikes are, the more repellent the surface was. So.
And if you think about the concept of a bed of nails, if you just have a single nail or nails spread out, you couldn't lay on them or they would puncture you. But that surface area increasing, spreading out the tension, that water can roll around on top of that surface and slide off easily. If you're walking out around the pond here at the Creation Museum, we've got lotus flowers out there. And sometimes you'll notice a little drop of water, and if the wind's blowing, that little drop of water will just kind of move all over the surface of the lotus leaf because God's designed them to shed that water and repel that very easily. And is that the product you use up on your head to keep that so shiny up there?
No, I use turtle wax. It's similar principle, but
similar principle.
Yeah, it's just amazing when you think of what God has made. When we look at the creatures that are out there, and when you really dive in and study them, I mean, even the experts who were doing this study, they didn't anticipate that this is how it was what they were gonna find. And it just shows us that God has thought of everything. And I mean, how many of you have ever wondered before today, what would happen to a mosquito if a little raindrop hit it as it's flying? I mean, we're probably all hoping for it, but because we don't like those things. But God thinks of it, and He thinks of ways to protect them, and it's amazing.
Yeah, just another example of care for His creation and the way He's designed and organized everything.
And what Dr. Rivera was saying with studying those things to learn how we might apply those in certain areas. And biomimicry is what we engineers use that in so many different ways, different animals and the features that they have, and to figure out ways to improve the things we use.
And they say nature is always full of surprises and counterexamples. Every time we understand something nature shows us, there's a whole lot of other things that we missed. But we certainly want to insert God in there and give Him the credit for those things. All right, our first article deals with an interesting item. Hand axe made from a hippopotamus femur discovered in Ethiopia was used by early ancestors 1.4 million years ago. Now, when we start thinking about these tools that we find, you can see some pictures of those there. These are surely things that have been designed by people to do different practices like cutting up meat or other types of things. And this one, interestingly, was made out of a hippo bone rather than rock. But what about the dating that they're subscribing to here?
Well, they're estimating it at 1.4 million years, but we know that can't be accurate since the Earth is only about 6,000 years old. So we know their dating is definitely off here. It was fascinating because it is the only second bone tool that they have found, because most often what they find is stone because it's so easy to make stone tools. But they were surprised too by obviously the intelligence that was represented here, but that doesn't surprise us because we know they were humans, right?
Yeah, they think
Made in the
these
image
were,
of God, so.
this is from their Homo erectus is a group they would assign these tools to, and they put them as one of the earliest human ancestors. We would describe to them full humanity. And when we think about the Tower of Babel, how does that play into this group of people, Tim?
Yeah, so we have a new exhibit in the Creation Museum. If you look at the starting points exhibit, you see the different, if you can say, types of humans. You have the anatomically modern human. You've got the Homo erectus, and then Neanderthal. They're all fully human. They're all descended from Adam and Eve. They're all descended from Noah and his wife. And then the event that we can use to explain a lot of that is what happened at Babel. So as you have different people groups spreading through different regions, if you have certain character traits that are dominant in one clan or family or however you want to divide them up, those things can come to the forefront. So if you've got a group of people who are all pretty tall and there aren't a lot of short people around in that group, well, pretty soon that whole group is going to be pretty tall. And the same thing can be true with other features. And so we can use that. We can use the Babel event to explain what's going on there. But yeah, they're fully human. One of the things I thought was interesting is that hand bones of early Homo erectus are almost unknown. So the hand bones are almost unknown. And then before that, they said, prior to the development of stone axes, our ancestors had weak wrists, which would not be able to grip small objects as powerfully as. They don't even have the hand bones. How do you know that? And here they're making a determination that the reason they don't find more of these tools is because humans would have had weak wrists at that time, strong enough to develop that, and we hadn't evolved the middle, the tendon, or metacarpal.
Metacarpal bone.
Yeah.
So you have to start from an evolutionary assumption to wind up at this explanation. Again, it's just an example of how our bias leads us to interpret things according to our worldview, which is not wrong. We just have to recognize that that's the case, and we would certainly want to apply a biblical worldview to these things and start from that point. So we would see these as tools used by people who had migrated out from Babel and were making use of things in the environment because they're basically on a quick camping trip where they didn't have a lot of technology to take along with them.
Yeah, and when you look at the Bible from a biblical perspective, did they have tools by, not this time period that they're using, but the time period when this tool was made? Of course. I mean, Noah built the ark, obviously used some tools to do that. Prior to that, you had Tubal-Cain, who was an instructor of all kinds of bronze and iron. To shape those things, you're using tools and probably making tools with that as well. So yeah, from a biblical perspective, people from the beginning were intelligent and capable of making tools and using them.
All right, our next article takes us to an interesting topic from Discern, a great news source for you to check out. BLM speaker, there is one common enemy, the white man. We need to get rid of them. Now, this was a young person who identifies as part of the Black LGBTQ community in Great Britain and speaking on a platform at some type of event. And the pronouncements here, we're talking about how all of these different oppressor groups and different things are happening, but the common theme was this idea of intersectionality. Now, if you're not familiar with that, that's the idea that there are different groups that are oppressed in different ways, and if you have different oppressor classes, you can accumulate those and you can be more oppressed than other people. So if you're homosexual and black and Muslim, you get
and female.
Yeah, 3 check marks, and you get more points in the intersectionality score. Where if you're like me, you're a white Christian male who lives in America, you get 0 points in that scale because I have all the power. And so it's talking about this idea. And this is a very shocking type of clarity from this person and this organization. But it really comes down to the idea of speaking about these things from a Marxist ideology.
And
So-
that's really the goal. That's what we're seeing. A lot of Marxism was all about creating as much social unrest as possible so that you can create this revolution violently if necessary. That's what they wanted it to come about. And so what we see going on in our culture today is a result of that kind of thinking. And that's not to say that everybody who's protested in the last 4 or 5 months is doing it for that reason, but a lot of the agitators, a lot of the people who are going around destroying things, it's this philosophy that is designed to create as much unrest as possible. And there is no reasoning with them to try to get through it because they don't want to have a solution. They want to destroy things.
Yeah,
and
and
that's
that
their
is
goal.
a stated goal of the Black Lives Matter organization itself. So when we think about these things, one of the most disturbing things to me, and this wasn't spelled out in the article itself, but right at the end of the video, talking about how do we get rid of the white man, the white males who are oppressing everybody. One of the solutions there was kill the rich, he quotes right at the end. And again, back to a Marxist philosophy. But if we're really valuing all human beings, regardless of their skin color, we do that because they're made in the image of God.
Right.
Yeah, image bearers of the Creator God, regardless of what shade of, melanin it may be expressed by their genetic makeup. That's the key. Is people don't realize that we're all image bearers. We're all just one human race, one humankind, as we call it here in our exhibit, right? Regardless of skin color, we're just one humankind sharing 99% of our DNA, right? We're, it's just, I think if they taught more of the actual science and the truth of it, even in our public school classrooms, what a difference we'd see in our culture.
All right, our next article is from The Blaze, and it's titled "Canceled. Crosswalk signals are now considered racist and oppressive." Now, why do you think that might be so? What image appears on most crosswalk symbols? A white man, okay? And so if you're looking to be offended by things, this is obviously an opportunity for that. So we think about the structure that's here. We basically have a hand that's held up to say stop, and it's usually reddish or orange. And then you've got the individual that's walking that's colored white. Now you did a little extra research on this. Where did those ideas come from?
So they actually come from like the National Highway Administration, and according to the Federal National Highway Administration, it is a neutral figure, right? And if they don't call the actual color white, they say it's actually lunar is the actual name of the color, because that's just what the rods and cones in our eyes pick up certain wavelengths. And they said that is the best color for the human eye to detect a bright color that tells you basically it's okay to walk. And the reason they stopped using the terms walk and don't walk is just because we became very multicultural in the 1940s, and they realized some people couldn't read the terms walk and not walk. So they, went to a figure just to make it universally, understandable for people to know whether to stop or walk. It was never intended, to have any type of racial connotation.
Yeah,
to
and
it.
what's going to happen if we carry this out?
Well, two problems. I mean, one, I'm not white. If you look, I'm pretty fair-skinned, but it's not white.
This is white.
But the other thing is, I think that these crosswalk things, I think they're discriminatory against people who are in wheelchairs. I mean, why does it have to be somebody walking? Why can't it be power? I mean, where do we draw the line? At what point does this absurdity end? Well, for a lot of these people, they don't want it to end because you want to create as much division, as much discord as possible. And that's what we're seeing in our culture.
All right, moving on to our next article. We have one coming talking about climate change, how Earth's climate changes naturally and why things are different now. So we think about the way that the climate is affected by different things. Now, when we think about climate, we want to distinguish that from weather. Climate is long-term weather patterns. Weather is what happens on a day-to-day or yearly cycle, those types of things. So we think about the climate of the Earth. When we analyze those things, we have a certain amount of records that we can look at, but a lot of those things are done through the approach of historical science, trying to interpret things in the past based on the evidence that we have in the present. And so this article does a good job of identifying all of the different things that can affect the climate on a very large scale. from the way that the Earth's axis wobbles and the precession as the North Pole changes its orientation over time, the sun's effects, the volcanism, asteroid impacts, all of these things. So it's a very complicated structure when we come to analyze all that's happening in the climate. So with your background as a forensic scientist and all the different things that go into analyzing a crime scene, it's kind of like what's happening here with the climate.
Because historical science is different. We use observational techniques, yes, but we have to apply that analysis to something that happened in the past, something that we weren't there to directly observe. And so you have to draw assumptions and make interpretations from that, and a lot of that stems from that particular scientist's worldview. So because of that, mistakes can be made, right? Misinterpretations can happen, and we definitely see some of that represented in this article for sure. So
yeah, this article is very detailed. He goes through these 10 different mechanisms that could be affecting, that long-term climate things. And what's interesting is they're all stated matter-of-factly. We, as if in 3.5 billion years ago, we know it was exactly like this when the Earth's oceans were doing these things and when all of this was happening. And they just describe it as fact, not as this is what the evidence suggests, they might say sometimes, but they don't even use any of that terminology, and yet they're showing how sophisticated all of this is and how many different factors are going into it. Whereas if one little tiny detail was different in these studies, it would tweak everything. And yet that's what we see so often in scientific research, is that we're discovering new things and we're realizing, oh, we didn't quite know everything we thought we knew before. And so is it going to be a year from now when a lot of these are different, when their beliefs about what we're going on in those times are different? So even though they might be accurately describing certain factors that can affect the climate, the story that they're attaching to it is just that, it's a story. And there's a lot of make-believe in there.
Yeah, one of those dogmatic statements says, in part, it's because we can clearly show the causal link between carbon dioxide emissions from human activity and the 1.28 degrees Celsius rising global temperature increase since pre-industrial times. So there's a dogmatic claim there that we absolutely know that it's human-produced CO2 that's causing all of these things. But with all of those natural factors, how can you really demand that? One thing that's very interesting they talked about were solar cycles, and this idea of the Maunder minimum, a period where the solar brightness was very low, and how that may have triggered the little ice age. But they dogmatically say that wasn't it. It was probably more to do with volcanic activity. And if volcanoes erupting on a large scale can cause that degree of cooling to cause a miniature ice age in Europe and other areas in the 17th and 18th century, then there's going to be a lot of impact. And that was definitely not human-caused impact. Tim, what does the Bible have to give us guidance here about how we understand climate change and those things over time?
Yeah, there's a couple things. One, just in terms of the earth in general, God gave man dominion over the earth. It doesn't mean that we dominate it and destroy it and ruin it. We're called to be good stewards of what he has given us. And so we should be taking care of things to a responsible level, but we don't go overboard to the point where we worship and serve the creature rather than the creator, which is what too many people do when they get involved in this sort of thing. But the Bible also tells us that people are going to be around until the Lord returns and until this final judgment occurs. And the Bible tells us the earth is going to be burned up at that point. So there will be a global warming that takes place, but that is it's going to be very instantaneous, and it's going to be a lot different than what these people are anticipating. But Roger, I find it interesting that a lot of times from an evolutionary perspective, man is always to blame for all of these things. What's so inconsistent about that idea that?
Well, if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, isn't man just part of nature? So how can anything that man does be unnatural? Okay? Anything that we do is part of nature. Now, we classify those things a little differently because we understand that God has given us dominion and we can do synthetic activities here on the earth. But from an evolutionary perspective, there's no reason to make that type of distinction. Everything man does is just part of nature. And so there's a lot of inconsistency going on there.
Right, they don't get mad at the lion for eating a zebra or anything like that.
Yeah.
So why would they be mad if a human being, kills off a polar bear there to lead into our next one a little bit?
Or burning down the rainforest.
Right.
We're just trying to make more food for ourselves. It's just part of nature.
If we're at the top of the food chain, we can do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that plays right into the next article,
Yes.
which is titled Climate Change on Track to Wipe Out Polar Bears by 2100. Again.
Again.
We've heard this
Many
idea
times.
repeated multiple times over the years. And the idea here is that with the temperature rising, look at that poor forlorn polar bear mom and her little cubs are going to
babies
die.
are
The
so sad.
emotionalism attached to that image is very intentional in the message that this article is trying to send you. And don't let those things deceive you. Okay? Yes, they're cute, but they're creatures. They're not people starving there, where many of these in the environmental movement want to equate people and animals together. And you had an opportunity to look up some of the actual statistics
Yeah, I
for
did, because I
polar
was like, well,
bears.
you know, how endangered are the polar bears, right? So if you go back just a few decades, they estimated, and we're not sure quite how accurate that is, but there was, you know, somewhere around 6,000, maybe a few more polar bears around 1973. As of 2015, there were over 31,000 estimated polar bears. So they're actually increasing in numbers. And what scientists have found is that even though maybe some pockets or populations of polar bears are decreasing, some others, like they said, the Canadian Arctic, have a 40% plus growth in polar bear populations. So we find they're very adaptive, which is genetically how God designed them to be.
Yeah, and we would expect that if these are creatures that came off of the Ark. If you've been to the Ark Encounter and seen the bear exhibit, we think that this bear kind gets off the Ark and they diversify into all the bears that we see around the world today. And polar bears are just one of those recent diversifications. So they will adapt to that changing environment because God's given them that in their DNA and other abilities to be able to confront those changing environments and change to those things. They weren't white when they came off the Ark, and that's an adaptation that's come about since that time.
It is a good example, too, of our creation mandate to protect the earth, because prior to 1973, they were hunted on a much larger scale, and then they did put protective measures into place in 1973, and now we see the populations exploding, and that's just an example of where we step in and say we need to protect this, you know, particular animal because you know we are hunting it to extinction. So.
There's a great book we'd recommend to you, A Different Shade of Green by Dr. Gordon Wilson, writes a lot for our magazine and other things as well. Talks about that idea from a truly creation perspective, as we're being good stewards of God's creation and all that he's given us, how to make sure that happens. We've got other relationships with the Cornwall Alliance and others who help us understand these things and talk about them from a biblical perspective.
Right, and we have information at the Ararat Ridge Zoo down at the Ark on a biblical view of conservation versus the way we see a secular view of conservation and how oftentimes things are taken overboard. In fact, Roger, you said that that they treat them as though they're equal to humans. Actually, a lot of times the people who are like the extreme environmentalists, humans are you know, they're a
Humans are the
plague. They need to be
virus on
wiped
the
out.
planet,
They got to
yeah.
get rid of all of the humans. So they're more, in their view, animals are more important. And yet, if you think about it again, like we just talked about from an evolutionary perspective, we should at least be the same. That we're just part of nature. You can't really fault us for doing what nature tells us to do. It's not like we have the free will to do it from an evolutionary and atheistic perspective. We're just determined by our genes, by the chemicals. We have no choice in the matter. We're just doing it.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of inconsistency. But what is Coca-Cola going to do? How are they going to advertise anything if the polar bears go bye-bye? I mean,
Well, one of the ideas in this article was to actually move the polar bears to Antarctica, where they would actually be with the penguins that they're in those Coke commercials with, rather than the Arctic. So there are different ideas, conservation ideas, if they do become threatened, and there's no reason not to try to preserve them, but not at the detriment of humans. Human life, we have to place value in human life above the other creatures that God has made. All right, our next article takes us to this lovely little bonobo picture. It says, the friendliest, not the fittest, is the key to evolutionary survival, scientists argue in a book. So this is a new book that's putting out the hypothesis or the explanation for survival, not necessarily being the strongest and most able to dominate survives. Now, many Christians have a bit of a misconception about this idea of what the survival of the fittest means. We should never understand survival of the fittest to always be strongest, most dominant, those types of things. Fitness is defined as its ability to survive in a given environment. And in this explanation, they're actually saying that kindness and compassion and sharing in these different animals has actually promoted their evolutionary advance and been a benefit to them over the strong, thuggish idea that we usually attach to that. So that's not contrary to Darwin's idea. It actually fits within that model. So many times we misunderstand that and create kind of a straw man. So we want to represent that correctly. But they talk about dogs a lot in this article and,
Yes.
and how dogs are these wonderful examples of that.
In fact, they said it was Exhibit A for this friendliness theory that they came up with. And they actually said that friendliness is the winning strategy. It's the secret to our species' success. They said is the same as it is with dogs. So who would have thought, right? That the secret to our success is to model friendly dog.
Yeah, they talked about how dogs, the ones that have been domesticated, there's millions of those, but look at wolves, which aren't domesticated, and they're aggressive and they're violent and they're endangered in some places. And so as if the dogs chose to get friendlier. I mean, this is a human decision to domesticate them and then to breed them and everything.
But that's the way the article reads.
Yeah, the way the article reads that the dog kind of chose.
The dogs chose to engage in these relationships.
And the animals that do that thrive. I noticed they didn't use sharks as an example. I wonder why that is. But they just found some examples where certain animals seem friendlier than others, and then said, see, look how they thrive. Well, yeah, and certain things that obviously it's benefiting certain animals for them to be of certain use to humans. Certain animals that get killed and eaten by humans, not always so much, but we breed them and we continue to have them. So that's why there are so many pigs and cows and other things. But
it also used the example of the cooperation in different organisms, specifically thinking about flowering plants and the pollinators that carry their pollen from flower to flower and help continue that species. So there are lots of examples of this cooperation between different species or within species all over the place. Think about an ant colony or a beehive, those types of things. We have lots of cooperation and division of labor and different roles that those things are undergoing. But rather than thinking of those as chance events that happened to come along and give this group or that group a benefit, we would understand, of course, those things to be created specially by God. And from a biblical perspective, we don't have a problem explaining those intricate relationships that exist because God has created those things and he's given the information, the DNA inside those organisms to allow them to interact with one another, to adapt to changing environments and to cooperate in those different ways.
Right, so you're talking about like symbiotic relationships, and that's one of the problems that comes in with people with Christians who want to add billions of years to the Bible and they're following the evolutionary timeline, or they'll say that you can just add that billions of years to Genesis chapter 1. Well, then you lose a whole bunch of those symbiotic relationships. So the plants, the flowering plants, rely on the bees and other creatures that, according to that timeline, would have been created for millions of years later. So how did they survive? How did they thrive during that time? The Bible tells us that God created each of those things, and of course all these different symbiotic relationships we see were planned by him just to show the intricacy of life, to bring glory to him.
All right, we've got another article here dealing with the Hyksos population and the Hyksos 15th dynasty rulers of ancient Egypt were an internal takeover. Now, if you're not familiar with this is a group within the Egyptian dynasties that seems to be a little bit of an out-of-place group. How did these people who weren't African and North African in their origin come to dominate when we think about the Egyptian dynasties and the pharaohs that are ruling there? And so what they've done is they've compared the ratios of strontium isotopes in teeth to look at how much strontium is in different areas. And so if this person was raised in this area and they die in this area, does their strontium level match which region they're from and how long they lived here? So they've been able to analyze some of those pieces. So there can't be a lot of information they're drawing these conclusions from, but they found that a large percentage of this Hyksos populace was non-local to Egypt. They're from another area. What area would they have been from, Tim?
Well, it says they're from Western Asia, really from what we would say is the land of Israel back then, land of Canaan, and surrounding areas, which fits pretty nicely with what the Bible talks about. And they're talking about a time period prior to at least according to their dating, it would be prior to the Exodus. But there is a lot of debate, a lot of discussion, even among Christians and archaeologists about some of the timing of these events. But from our perspective, it fits pretty well with what the Bible tells us. In fact, pretty well is kind of an understatement. It fits really well with what the Bible talks about.
Another piece of the puzzle as we start to think about who all these rulers were, the Bible just calls them Pharaoh, 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 with not a lot of names attached. So interesting information to add. All right, let's tackle this last article we've got today. It says, humans reached the Americas 15,000 years earlier than thought. Now, that's a big change when we think about the percentage-wise, because this almost doubles, or more than doubles, the time that the people, these scientists thought that people were in the Americas before then, having migrated across. But again, we're going to look at this from a biblical perspective. So when we think about these people coming over earlier, where would all these people have come from who were found in the Americas that long ago?
No, because of Babel, right? We had our confusion of languages and people moving in people groups, and we know the flood was approximately 4,300 years ago, and so we know it couldn't possibly not be any, later than at that point, right? Because we know at that point we would have had the flood, we would have had a few hundred years after that our Babel dispersion, and so somewhere around 4,000 years ago, maybe we would have seen the earliest populations moving into these.
Yeah, so these are clearly post-flood sediments that are present there.
And this, going back to the point I made just a few minutes ago about the way that some Christians will try to add the millions of years to Scripture, they'll use the secular dates for everything. So they'll look at this and say, oh, humans were around 15,000 years earlier. Well, you have somebody like Hugh Ross, he's a progressive creationist from Reasons to Believe, and he's one of the most popular of these guys who add the billions of years. He says that Adam was created sometime around 25,000 years ago. Well, that would mean the Australian Aborigines who have been around allegedly for 50,000 years, and these early Native Americans that they're talking about that have been around from 30,000 years ago, they weren't descendants of Adam, meaning that Jesus didn't die for them. They can't be saved.
Yeah,
so they're really non-human is what he's saying.
Would be in Adam's race.
Right. Now, he wouldn't come out and he wouldn't be consistent enough in his thinking to say that. He would say, no, they're clearly human. But his philosophy, the things that he's borrowing from, are saying that, yeah, they wouldn't be descendants of Adam, therefore they couldn't be saved. So there's a lot of problems whenever you try to add the ideas from outside of the Bible to reinterpret what it plainly says, you create a lot of difficulties.
Yeah, and these are people who could have come over to the Americas on boats, using the land bridges, lots of different methods of transportation. And all those ideas are absolutely ruled out by the evolutionists because they don't think people were smart enough by that point or had that level of technology then.
So people couldn't make boats after the flood? I mean, there was never a big boat or anything?
There was an example of a big boat people could have modeled to be able to get across that ocean span. All right. Well, that's all we've got for you today, and we thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again next week on Answers News.
Thank you so much to our speakers. Thank you very much.